The year is 1965. The humidity in Singapore is suffocating, thick with the heat of the tropics and the even heavier weight of political uncertainty. The island nation has just been expelled from Malaysia, cast out into a hostile sea of neighbors who view its very existence as an anomaly. The British Empire is in retreat, their ships slowly leaving the harbor, and in the vacuum of power, new predators are circling. Among them is the United States of America, the titan of the Cold War, fresh from toppling governments in Iran, Guatemala, and the Congo, and now looking to secure its grip on Southeast Asia as the Vietnam War begins to boil over. In Washington, D.C., the men in grey suits view Singapore as nothing more than a strategic coordinate on a map, a pawn to be moved or sacrificed in the grand game against communism. They view its leader, a fiery, Cambridge-educated lawyer named Kuan, as a volatile but ultimately manageable local politician. They believe they can do what they do everywhere else, buy influence, plant assets, and pull the strings from the shadows. They are about to make a catastrophic miscalculation. The incident that would shatter American credibility in the region begins not in a back room, but under the glare of television lights. It is August 31st, 1965. Kuan is sitting for an interview, and the topic turns to the precarious survival of his newborn nation. The world expects a plea for aid, a begging hand extended toward the superpowers. Instead, Kuan clenches his fist and drops a rhetorical bomb. He tells the press a story that sounds like the plot of a paperback thriller. He alleges that 5 years prior, in 1960, the Central Intelligence Agency, the feared and revered CIA, had attempted to corrupt the Singaporean government from the inside. He claims that an American agent had approached a senior officer of Singapore's special branch, the Domestic Intelligence Service, and offered him a bribe to feed information to Washington. The accusation sends shockwaves through the diplomatic cables. For a leader of a tiny third-world island, one with no natural resources, no army, and no drinking water of its own, to publicly accuse the CIA of incompetence and malevolence is unheard of. It is an act of diplomatic suicide. Washington's reaction is swift, predictable, and dripping with condescension. The U.S. State Department issues an immediate, formal denial. They do not just brush it off, they go on the offensive. A State Department spokesman stands before the White House press corps and issues a flat denial, stating that Kuan's allegations are without foundation. In diplomatic speak, they are calling the Prime Minister of Singapore a liar. They are banking on the credibility of the United States versus the word of a man running a country that most Americans couldn't find on a map. They assume the story will die. They assume Kuan will retreat, chastised by the rebuke of a superpower. But they forgot one crucial detail. Kuan was a lawyer before he was a politician, and a lawyer never asks a question to which he does not already know the answer. More importantly, a lawyer never makes an accusation without evidence. While the State Department was busy issuing denials and painting him as a fabulist, Kuan was sitting in his office at City Hall, looking at a safe. Inside that safe was a piece of paper that he had kept hidden for years, a get-out-of-jail-free card that he had saved for a rainy day, and the rain had just started falling. The next day, Kuan summoned the press again. The mood was electric. He did not shout. He simply produced the evidence. It was not a grainy photo or a hearsay testimony. It was a letter, and not just any letter. It was an official diplomatic correspondence signed by Dean Rusk. Dean Rusk was not a low-level bureaucrat. He was the United States Secretary of State under John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson. He was one of the most powerful men on earth, and there, on official letterhead, was a confidential apology from Rusk to Kuan, dating back to the aftermath of the botched operation in 1961. The letter explicitly admitted to the incident, apologized for the impropriety of the CIA agent, and assured the Prime Minister that such actions would not be repeated. The reveal was devastating. It was a checkmate in one move. In an instant, the narrative flipped. The United States government had been caught not only spying on a friendly nation, but lying about it to the entire world. The New York Times ran the headline, exposing the State Department's duplicity. The humiliation in Washington was total. The State Department was forced to retract its denial, issuing a meager correction that they had forgotten about the letter due to a filing error. It was a pathetic excuse that only deepened the embarrassment. Lee Kuan Yew had effectively dragged the CIA and the US State Department into the town square and stripped them naked. He didn't stop there. He twisted the knife. He recounted the details of the failed negotiation that followed the capture of the CIA agent. He revealed that he had offered to keep the incident quiet in exchange for $33 million, or $3 million, depending on the specific exchange rate calculation of the time, in economic development aid for Singapore. He framed it not as blackmail, but as compensation for the insult to Singapore's sovereignty. The Americans, in their hubris, had offered a paltry sum to be paid directly to Lee Kuan Yew's political party, the PAP, rather than to the state. This, Lee explained to the world, was the ultimate insult. "I am not a mercenary," he declared. "You cannot buy me or my party." By revealing the attempted payoff, he painted the Americans not just as incompetent spies, but as corruptors who believed everyone had a price. He positioned Singapore as the moral victor, a nation that might be poor, but was fiercely incorruptible. Why start our story here? Why is this specific showdown the perfect lens through which to view the enigma of Lee Kuan Yew? Because this incident encapsulates the grand strategy of a man who ruled with a chip on his shoulder, the size of a mountain. This documentary is not just about a botched spy operation. It is about the weaponization of truth. Lee Kuan Yew understood something that few other leaders of small nations grasped. In the nuclear age, you don't fight a superpower with guns. You fight them with shame. You fight them by exposing the gap between their rhetoric of freedom and their reality of subversion. This moment defined Singapore's foreign policy for the next 50 years. It established the poison shrimp doctrine, the idea that Singapore, though small and defenseless, would be indigestible to any predator that tried to swallow it. Lee Kuan Yew signaled to the world, to the British, the Malaysians, the Indonesians and the communists, that he was crazy enough to burn bridges if his sovereignty was threatened. He showed that he feared no one. If he was willing to humiliate the United States, the provider of the region's security umbrella, over a matter of principle, what would he do to a lesser enemy? Furthermore, this introduction serves as a masterclass in psychological warfare. Lee Kuan Yew knew the CIA was powerful, but he also knew they operated in the shadows. By dragging them into the light, he took away their greatest advantage. He turned their secrecy against them. Throughout this film, we will peel back the layers of this confrontation. We will look at the mechanics of the spy ring that the CIA tried to build in Singapore. We will explore the deep-seated paranoia Lee had regarding American interference, a paranoia that led him to believe the CIA was funding newspapers and opposition lawyers to destabilize his rule. We will see how he used the specter of foreign interference to justify his own draconian internal security measures. But most importantly, this opening module sets the stakes. Singapore in the 1960s was a playground of spies. It was the Casablanca of the East. Everyone was watching everyone. The British MI6, the American CIA, the Soviet KGB, and the Chinese MSS were all vying for control of the strategic Malacca Strait. In the middle of this shark tank swam Lee Kuan Yew, a man with no navy and no air force, armed only with a sharp tongue, a sharper intellect, and a vault full of secrets. The ultimatum he delivered to the United States, "Leave us alone or we will embarrass you," was a gamble that could have resulted in a CIA-backed coup. Instead, it resulted in a begrudging respect that allowed Singapore to rise. As we delve deeper into this story, remember the image of that press conference. Remember the look of calculated fury in Lee Kuan Yew's eyes. He was telling the world that the age of colonialism was over, and that the age of the neo-colonial puppet master would not find a foothold in Singapore. He was drawing a line in the sand. And as Dean Rusk and the CIA found out, you cross Lee Kuan Yew's line at your own peril. This is the story of how a mosquito made an elephant bleed. This is the story of how Lee Kuan Yew beat the CIA at their own game. To understand why a prime minister would risk political suicide to humiliate a superpower, we must first understand the board on which this dangerous game was being played. To the modern tourist, Singapore is a gleaming city-state of glass towers, manicured gardens and sterile efficiency. But to the intelligence officer landing at Paya Lebar Airport in the 1960s, Singapore was a very different beast. It was the geopolitical equivalent of a knife fight in a dark alley. It was the heart of darkness of Southeast Asia, a sweaty, volatile, claustrophobic island, teeming with racial tension, communist subversion, and imperial ambition. It was not a destination, it was a pivot point. The world was burning. To the north, the jungles of Indochina were being decimated by napalm as the Vietnam War escalated into a meat grinder. To the south, Indonesia was convulsing under the erratic nationalist fervor of President Sukarno, who was flirting with Beijing and threatening to crush his neighbors. And right in the center, sitting atop the most critical shipping lane on planet Earth, was Singapore. The American obsession with Singapore was not sentimental, it was logistical. The CIA did not care about the culture or the food. They cared about the Strait of Malacca. This narrow stretch of water is the jugular vein of the global economy. It connects the Indian Ocean to the Pacific. It is the conduit through which the oil of the Middle East flows to fuel the factories of Japan and East Asia. In the binary logic of the Cold War, the equation was simple. Whoever controls the strait controls Asia. If Singapore were to fall to the communists, if it became a third China, as many feared, the West would lose its foothold. The domino theory, championed by Eisenhower and Kennedy, posited that if Vietnam fell, the rest of the region would collapse in quick succession. Singapore was the last domino. It was the cork in the bottle. For decades, the security of this vital choke point had been the responsibility of the British Empire. The British had built Singapore, fortified it, and maintained massive naval and air bases on the island. For the CIA, this was convenient. They could focus on fighting the Viet Cong, while the British kept the peace in the Malacca Strait. But by the mid-1960s, the British Empire was bankrupt. London had signaled its intent to withdraw east of Suez. The sun was finally setting on the Union Jack. This created a terrifying vacuum. In geopolitics, power abhors a vacuum. The Americans knew that as soon as the British marched out, someone else would march in. They were determined that it would be them, not the Soviets or the Chinese. This transition period turned Singapore into a playground for spies. It became the Casablanca of the East. The bars of Bugis Street and the lobbies of the Raffles Hotel were crawling with operatives. The KGB was trying to infiltrate the trade unions. The Chinese Communist Party was funding student radicals. And the CIA was trying to buy the government. The agency viewed Singapore as a piece of real estate that needed new management. They looked at Lee Kuan Yew, and they saw a problem. Yes, he was anti-communist, but he was also fiercely, stubbornly independent. He was an Asiatic intellectual who quoted Shakespeare and refused to take orders. In the eyes of Langley, Virginia, he was unpredictable, and the CIA hates unpredictability. They preferred strongmen they could control, generals they could bribe, or puppets they could install. This brings us to the psychology of Lee Kuan Yew himself. To understand his actions, you must understand his paranoia. But paranoia is perhaps the wrong word, for paranoia implies an irrational fear. Lee's fear was entirely rational. He was a student of history. He read the intelligence reports. He knew exactly how the CIA operated. He had watched from afar as the agency toppled Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran in 1953 because he dared to nationalize oil. He saw them destroy Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954 to protect the interests of a fruit company. He saw the meddling in Vietnam that led to the assassination of Ngo Dinh Diem. Lee Kuan Yew looked at these events and saw a pattern. The Americans were cowboys. They would come in with guns blazing and wallets open, destabilize a society to achieve a short-term goal, and leave chaos in their wake. Lee Kuan Yew famously said, "The Americans are a very great people, but they are prone to missionary zeal. They want to convert you." He feared that the CIA did not want allies. They wanted vassals. He knew that if he allowed the CIA to sink its claws into Singapore's military and intelligence services, he would lose control of his own country. He would become just another client state, another domino to be knocked over when Washington decided it was expedient. His distrust was visceral. He viewed the British as imperialists with manners, devils he knew and understood. He viewed the Americans as heavy-handed amateurs, dangerous because they possessed infinite money and very little cultural understanding. The friction was compounded by the fact that Lee Kuan Yew was fighting a war on two fronts. On the streets, he was fighting the Barisan Socialis, the communist front that controlled the unions and threatened to tear the country apart with strikes and riots. He needed Western support to fight them, but he could not afford to look like a Western puppet. If the Chinese-speaking masses of Singapore believed that Lee Kuan Yew was a stooge of the CIA, he would lose his mandate. The communists would paint him as a running dog of American imperialism. To survive, he had to walk a razor's edge. He had to accept Western guns while rejecting Western masters. He had to be anti-communist but also anti-American interference. This necessitated a domestic counterintelligence strategy of absolute ruthlessness. Lee Kuan Yew knew he could not stop the CIA from trying to infiltrate Singapore, so he had to build an immune system strong enough to detect the virus. He poured resources into two organizations that would become the pillars of his regime: the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, CPIB, and the Security and Intelligence Division, SID. The CPIB is often cited today as the reason for Singapore's squeaky clean business reputation, but in the 1960s, it served a darker, more existential purpose. Lee Kuan Yew knew that the easiest way for a foreign power to buy a country was to buy its men. If a police chief, a general, or a minister could be bribed, the state was compromised. The CPIB was weaponized to ensure that no one, absolutely no one, was above scrutiny. It made the cost of taking a bribe infinite. By creating a culture where corruption was synonymous with treason, Lee Kuan Yew inoculated his civil service against CIA cash. When the American agent approached the Singaporean officer in 1960 with a stack of banknotes, the officer didn't take it because he was a saint. He didn't take it because he knew the CPIB was watching, and he knew Lee Kuan Yew would destroy him if he turned. The SID, on the other hand, was the shield. Modeled after the British MI5 but adapted for the Asian context, the SID was tasked with monitoring threats both internal and external. They watched the communists in the jungle, but they also watched the diplomats at the American embassy. They tapped phones, they followed cars, they mapped the networks of influence. Lee Kuan Yew demanded to know who was having lunch with whom. He demanded to know which journalists were receiving stipends from foreign organizations. He turned Singapore into a panopticon, a glass house where secrets were hard to keep. The Americans, used to operating in countries with weak institutions and corrupt officials, severely underestimated this environment. They looked at Singapore and saw a third-world backwater. They assumed the police were purchasable and the politicians were desperate. They did not realize that Lee Kuan Yew had constructed a state apparatus designed specifically to trap them. They walked into Singapore thinking they were entering a candy store, unaware they were stepping into a bear trap. This geopolitical context explains the ferocity of Lee Kuan Yew's response in 1965. When he exposed the CIA bribe, he wasn't just angry about one agent. He was signaling to Washington that he knew their playbook. He was telling them, "I am not Mossadegh. I am not Diem. You cannot do to me what you did to them." The incident was a preemptive strike. By humiliating the CIA early in his tenure, he was inoculating his nation against future coups. He was raising the political cost of interference so high that the Americans would think twice before trying it again. The playground of spies was a dangerous place, but Lee Kuan Yew decided that if he couldn't kick the spies out, he would make them play by his rules. He understood that in the game of nations there are no friends, only interests, and Singapore's interest was survival. To the CIA, Singapore was a strategic asset. To Lee Kuan Yew, it was the only home he had, and he was willing to burn the house down rather than hand the keys over to a stranger in a trench coat. This mindset, the siege mentality of a leader convinced the world was out to get him, set the stage for the specific incident of the polygraph, the trap that would catch the CIA with its hand in the cookie jar. The story of the CIA's humiliation in Singapore begins not with a grand geopolitical maneuver, but with a tawdry, clumsy attempt at recruitment that reads less like a John le Carré novel and more like a farce of errors. The year was 1960. Singapore was still a self-governing state under the British, delicately navigating its path toward merger with Malaya. The atmosphere was rife with suspicion. In the shadows of this transition, the Central Intelligence Agency decided it needed a shortcut. They weren't satisfied with the official intelligence sharing provided by their British cousins in MI6. They wanted their own eyes and ears inside the inner circle of Lee Kuan Yew. They wanted a mole. To achieve this, they dispatched an agent to Singapore, a man whose identity remains shrouded in the classified files of history, but whose actions paint a portrait of supreme American arrogance. He was not a master of subtle statecraft. He was what intelligence historians might call a second-rate James Bond, a man who believed that a thick wallet and a confident smile were the only tools required to buy loyalty in the Orient. The target of this operation was a mid-level officer within the Singapore Special Branch. The choice of target was logical. The Special Branch was the nerve center of the island's security. They knew where the communists were hiding, they knew what the unions were planning, and most importantly, they knew what Lee Kuan Yew was thinking. If the CIA could own a man inside the Special Branch, they would own the secrets of the state. The approach was made in the classic style of Cold War espionage. There were shadowed meetings, hushed conversations in nondescript locations, and finally, the pitch. The American agent offered the Singaporean officer a significant sum of money, a fortune by the standards of the time, in exchange for a steady stream of classified information. It was a transaction that had played out thousands of times in capitals across the world, from Berlin to Bangkok. The American assumed the outcome was a foregone conclusion. He assumed that this local officer, likely underpaid and overworked, would jump at the chance to serve the world's greatest superpower. This was the CIA's fatal error. It was not a failure of tradecraft, it was a failure of cultural understanding. They failed to realize that the Singapore Special Branch was not a mercenary force. It was being forged into a Praetorian Guard for a new kind of nation. The men who served Lee Kuan Yew did not serve him because he paid the best. They served him because they believed in the survival of Singapore, or perhaps more accurately, they feared the consequences of betraying him. When the CIA agent slid the envelope of cash across the table, the Singaporean officer did not see a ticket to a better life. He saw a test, and he knew that in Lee Kuan Yew's Singapore there were no secrets. If he took the money, the Special Branch would know. If the Special Branch knew, Lee Kuan Yew would know, and if Lee Kuan Yew knew, his life as he knew it was over. Instead of accepting the bribe, the officer did something that stunned the Americans. He reported the approach to his superiors immediately. The report went up the chain of command until it landed on the desk of the Prime Minister. Lee Kuan Yew's reaction was characteristically Machiavellian. He did not order the immediate arrest of the American agent. To arrest him now would be to catch a small fish and scare away the rest. Instead, Lee ordered the officer to accept the offer. He turned the target into a double agent. "Take their money," the order went. "Tell them what we want them to know. Let us see how far they are willing to go." For a brief period, the CIA believed they had succeeded. They thought they had successfully penetrated the Singaporean intelligence apparatus. The turned officer began feeding them chicken feed, low-level, harmless intelligence that had been carefully curated by Lee Kuan Yew's inner circle to look authentic without revealing anything sensitive. The American agent, flush with the success of his recruitment, began to push for more. He wanted higher clearance, deeper secrets, but as with all deception operations, the stress began to show. The CIA handlers, perhaps sensing a hesitation in their new asset, or simply following standard operating procedure to verify their investment, decided to escalate the vetting process. They didn't just want the officer's word, they wanted scientific proof of his loyalty. This led to the climax of the operation, the polygraph incident. The CIA arranged for a meeting in a safe house, a quiet residential unit tucked away from prying eyes. When the Singaporean officer arrived, he found the American agent waiting not with an envelope of cash, but with a machine. It was a polygraph, a lie detector. In 1960, this was cutting-edge technology, a symbol of American scientific superiority. The intent was to strap the officer into the machine, wire him up and ask him the hard questions. "Are you working for Lee Kuan Yew? Have you reported this meeting? Are you loyal to us?" It was a moment of supreme vulnerability. If the officer failed the test, he would be burned. If he refused, his cover was blown. But the Singaporean intelligence service was one step ahead. They had anticipated that the Americans would eventually try to tighten the noose. The safe house was not as safe as the CIA thought. While the American agent was busy setting up his wires and calibrating his needles, the trap was sprung. The doors burst open. The room was flooded with Special Branch officers. There was no shootout, no dramatic chase across rooftops. It was far more humiliating. The second-rate James Bond was caught standing over his machine, red-handed, in the middle of conducting an illegal intelligence operation on the soil of a friendly sovereign nation. The hunter had been captured by the prey. The scene in the safe house was the embodiment of the power shift Lee Kuan Yew was orchestrating. Here was the representative of the mighty United States, caught by the local police of a tiny island, holding a lie detector that ultimately failed to detect the biggest lie of all, that Singapore was for sale. The American agent was taken into custody. His diplomatic immunity was a grey area in the rough-and-tumble transition toward independence, but the evidence against him was undeniable. They had the money, they had the machine, and they had the confession of the double agent. At this juncture, a lesser leader might have gone to the press immediately. The headlines would have been sensational: CIA plot foiled, American spy arrested. It would have provided a short-term boost of nationalist pride. But Lee Kuan Yew was playing the long game. He looked at the shivering American agent in the interrogation cell and saw an asset. A public scandal in 1961 might have embarrassed the British, who were still technically responsible for Singapore's foreign affairs and defense. It might have derailed delicate trade talks. It might have forced the Americans to retaliate overtly. Lee realized that a secret victory was more valuable than a public one, at least for now. He decided to keep the incident under wraps. The Singaporean government did not parade the agent before the cameras. Instead, they quietly imprisoned him, holding him in the dank confines of a Singaporean jail cell. The psychological impact on the CIA station in the region was profound. Their man had simply vanished into the system. When the Americans finally realized what had happened, the dynamic of the relationship changed instantly. They were no longer the benevolent protectors dealing with a helpless ward. They were the court criminals dealing with a prosecutor. Lee Kuan Yew used the agent as leverage. He held him not for justice but for negotiation. He essentially sent a message to Washington: I have your man, I have the proof. I can destroy your reputation in Asia with a single press conference. What is his silence worth to you? This was the genesis of the negotiation that would follow. Lee decided to release the agent eventually, quietly deporting him back to the shadows from which he came, but he kept the file. He kept the photos. He kept the records of the interrogation. He put them in his personal safe, a loaded gun waiting for the right moment to be fired. The crime of the polygraph incident was not just the attempted bribery, it was the insult. The CIA had brought a machine to test the honesty of a Singaporean, implying that their word meant nothing. Lee Kuan Yew took that insult personally. He saw it as a metaphor for the Western attitude toward Asia. Trust the technology, buy the people, ignore the dignity. By flipping the operation, he proved that Asian cunning could defeat American technology. The failure of the polygraph test was a failure of the American imagination. They couldn't imagine a world where a Singaporean officer would fear his own prime minister more than he coveted American dollars. This botched operation remained a secret for 5 years. It sat in the dark, gathering dust, known only to a handful of men in the special branch and the CIA. The Americans likely breathed a sigh of relief, thinking they had dodged a bullet, thinking that Lee Kuan Yew had moved on. They assumed the debt was settled when the agent was returned. They did not understand that Lee Kuan Yew never forgot a debt. He was simply letting the interest accumulate, and when the time came to collect in 1965, the cost would be far higher than the bribe they had offered in that safe house. The incident of the polygraph was the crime. The demand for $33 million would be the punishment. With the CIA agent securely locked away in a Singaporean prison cell, the dynamic of power shifted from the streets to the boardroom. The game of cat and mouse was over. The game of poker had begun. Lee Kuan Yew held the cards. He had the physical evidence of American malfeasance, he had the confession, and he had the human collateral. The Americans, for their part, were desperate to make the problem disappear. They needed their man back, but more importantly, they needed the story buried. In the early 1960s, the United States was projecting an image of moral leadership in the fight against communism. To be caught engaging in dirty tricks against a friendly anti-communist government in a strategic choke point like Singapore would be a propaganda gift to Beijing and Moscow. They expected Lee Kuan Yew to be reasonable. They expected him to be transactional, and he was, but not in the currency they were accustomed to using. The negotiation that followed was one of the most bizarre and revealing chapters in the history of Cold War diplomacy. Lee Kuan Yew did not ask for the agent's execution, nor did he ask for a personal Swiss bank account. He approached the Americans with a proposition that was breathtaking in its audacity and its patriotism. He told them, effectively, I will release your man. I will keep this embarrassing episode out of the newspapers. I will save your reputation, but in exchange you must pay for the development of my country. Lee demanded compensation in the form of economic development aid for Singapore. The figure he put on the table was 33 million. There has been much historical debate regarding the exact figure. Some sources cite $33 million Singapore dollars, others claim $33 million US dollars, and later the Americans would claim the demand was for $3. 3 million. But the specific number is less important than what it represented. To Lee Kuan Yew, this was not extortion, it was restitution. He viewed the CIA's actions as an assault on the sovereignty of Singapore. They had tried to corrupt his officials, undermine his government, and treat his nation like a vassal state. In his legalistic mind, there were damages to be paid. If the Americans wanted to play the role of the great imperial power, they had to pay the imperial tax. He intended to use that money to build schools, pave roads, and jumpstart the economy of a nation that was struggling to survive. It was a transfer of wealth from the aggressor to the victim, a way to turn a moment of national humiliation into a moment of national growth. The American response to this demand revealed the depth of their arrogance and their fundamental misunderstanding of the man they were dealing with. The State Department officials and the CIA handlers reviewed the demand and scoffed. To them, $33 million was an astronomical sum to pay for the silence of a micro-state leader. They were used to dealing with dictators in Latin America and warlords in Africa who could be bought off with a crate of whiskey and a suitcase of cash. They viewed Lee Kuan Yew's demand as a bluff, the posturing of a small-time politician trying to punch above his weight. They did not believe he would actually go public. They reasoned that Singapore needed the United States more than the United States needed Singapore. They controlled the seas. They controlled the global economy. Surely Lee Kuan Yew would not be foolish enough to bite the hand that potentially could feed him. So the Americans countered, and their counteroffer was the spark that would eventually ignite the explosion of 1965. Instead of agreeing to the economic aid package for the state of Singapore, the United States government made a counter-proposal that was so culturally tone-deaf and so morally offensive to Lee Kuan Yew that it permanently scarred his view of American foreign policy. They told him essentially, "We cannot give you $33 million in official state aid for this mess. Congress would ask questions. It's too messy. However, we are willing to give a smaller sum, perhaps $3. $3 million, directly to you and your political party, the People's Action Party, to help you win elections and stay in power." It is difficult to overstate the magnitude of this insult. The Americans thought they were offering a sweet deal. They were offering to fund Lee's political machine, to secure his personal grip on power. In their minds, this is what all Third World leaders wanted: personal security and political longevity. They treated Lee Kuan Yew like a corrupt ward boss who needed walking around money. They failed to realize that they were speaking to a man whose entire political identity was built on the concept of incorruptibility. Lee Kuan Yew wore white shirts to political rallies to symbolize the purity of his party. He demanded absolute integrity from his subordinates. He had just thrown a CIA agent in jail specifically because that agent tried to bribe a Singaporean official. And now the United States government was trying to bribe him. Lee Kuan Yew's reaction was one of cold, incandescent fury. He rejected the offer immediately and with contempt. "I am not a mercenary," he would later tell the world. "You cannot buy me or my party." To Lee, the distinction was absolute. If the Americans gave money to the state of Singapore for infrastructure, it was aid. It was compensation. It was honorable. It benefited the people. But if they gave money to the party, it was a bribe. It was corruption. It would make him a paid agent of a foreign power. It would validate every accusation the communists made against him. If he took a single dollar for the PAP, he would be owned by Washington. He would cease to be the Prime Minister of an independent Singapore and become just another American asset, no better than the double agent he had ordered to play along. The Americans were baffled by his refusal. They couldn't understand why a politician would turn down free money. They interpreted his moral stance as obstinance. They refused to budge on the $33 million aid package, believing that Lee eventually would fold. They thought he was negotiating for a better price, not standing on principle. The talks broke down. The stalemate ensued. Eventually, in a gesture that Lee likely calculated would give him the moral high ground later, the CIA agent was released. He was quietly sent home, battered and bruised by the failure of his mission. The Americans likely clinked glasses, thinking they had escaped the trap. They had gotten their man back, they hadn't paid the $33 million, and the secret was still safe. They thought they had won the negotiation. But they had not won, they had merely armed a time bomb. By refusing the aid and offering a bribe instead, the Americans had handed Lee Kuan Yew a weapon more powerful than money. They handed him the truth. They had given him irrefutable proof that the United States viewed Singapore not as a partner, but as a purchasable commodity. They had proven that their rhetoric about democracy and rule of law was a facade, masking a cynical foreign policy of bribery and subversion. Lee Kuan Yew took this knowledge, and he took the records of the negotiation, and he filed them away. He knew that a day would come when he would need to assert his independence on the global stage. He knew that a day would come when he would need to prove to his own people, and to the hostile neighbors surrounding him, that he was nobody's puppet. The failure of this negotiation was a turning point in Singaporean history. It solidified Lee Kuan Yew's third worldist perspective, the idea that small nations must be fiercely self-reliant because the superpowers are inherently selfish and untrustworthy. It taught him that relying on American goodwill was a fool's errand. If he wanted something from the West, he would have to take it, or shame them into giving it. The $33 million that never came became a symbol of what was owed. It was a debt of honor. In the years that followed, as Singapore was kicked out of Malaysia and faced the terrifying prospect of survival alone, Lee never forgot the insult of the indecent proposal. He watched as the Americans poured billions into Vietnam, propping up corrupt regimes, while refusing to help a clean, efficient government in Singapore because it wouldn't take a bribe. It deepened his cynicism. It sharpened his rhetoric. And when the State Department made the mistake of calling him a liar in 1965, thinking he was just a desperate man making up stories, they didn't realize they were triggering a trap that had been set 4 years earlier. They thought the negotiation was over. Lee Kuan Yew knew it was just intermission. He hadn't taken their money, which meant he didn't owe them his silence. And silence was the only thing they had truly wanted to buy. By being cheap, by being arrogant, and by being insulting, the CIA and the State Department had saved themselves $33 million in 1961, only to pay a price in credibility in 1965 that no amount of money could fix. The indecent proposal was the moment the US lost the ability to control Lee Kuan Yew, and in doing so, created one of their most difficult, critical, and unmanageable partners of the 20th century. The year is 1965. Singapore has just been expelled from Malaysia, a traumatic birth that left the tiny island nation gasping for air in a region dominated by giants. Lee Kuan Yew is sleeping in an office at City Hall, fearful of assassination, his mind racing with the impossible mathematics of survival. To the rest of the world, he is a man on the brink of failure. To the Americans, he is a nuisance, a volatile, sharp-tongued Chinese leader who refuses to play by the rules of the Cold War. Tensions are at a boiling point. The Vietnam War is escalating nearby, and the United States is increasingly desperate to secure allies in Southeast Asia. They look at Singapore and see a strategic necessity. They look at Lee Kuan Yew and see a problem to be solved. But they have forgotten the cardinal rule of dealing with the Singaporean Prime Minister. Never back him into a corner, and never, ever call him a liar. The fuse was lit on August 31, 1965. In a televised interview that was broadcast globally, Lee Kuan Yew unleashed a torrent of grievances. He was angry at the British, suspicious of the Malaysians, and furious with the Americans. In a moment of calculated candor, he ripped the bandage off the wound that had been festering since 1961. He told the world about the CIA agent. He told the world about the bribe. He told the world that the United States government had attempted to corrupt his intelligence service and had offered money to his political party to cover it up. The reaction from Washington was immediate, reflexive, and catastrophically arrogant. The State Department machinery swung into action. In the halls of power in D.C., the consensus was that Lee Kuan Yew was bluffing. They believed he was a desperate politician making up stories to whip up anti-American sentiment for domestic political gain. They reasoned that no leader of such a small, vulnerable nation would dare to fabricate a charge against the United States unless he was mad. And if he wasn't mad, he certainly wouldn't have proof of an operation that happened 4 years ago. The files were classified. The agent was gone. It was his word against the might of the American empire. So the State Department spokesman, Marshall Wright, stepped up to the podium in Washington. With the full authority of the U.S. government behind him, he issued a formal denial. He didn't just deny the incident, he dismissed it with a wave of his hand. He stated on the record that Prime Minister Lee's allegations were without foundation. It was a polite, diplomatic way of calling the Prime Minister of Singapore a liar. The denial was beamed around the world. The American press, accustomed to trusting their government's official line, reported it as fact. Singapore leader makes wild accusations, the subtext read, U.S. denies CIA plot. For 24 hours, it seemed as though the Americans had won. They had controlled the narrative. They had painted Lee Kuan Yew as a hysterical, untrustworthy demagogue. They assumed that Lee would have to swallow the insult and move on, because surely he needed American investment and protection too much to escalate the fight. They were waiting for him to blink. But inside City Hall, Lee Kuan Yew was not blinking. He was smiling the cold, terrifying smile of a predator who has just watched his prey walk into a trap. The State Department's denial was exactly what he had been waiting for. By calling him a liar publicly, the Americans had raised the stakes to an existential level. This was no longer just about a spy. It was about Lee Kuan Yew's personal honor and the credibility of Singapore. If he backed down now, he would be finished. But he didn't need to back down. He had the ultimate weapon. Lee Kuan Yew summoned the Foreign Press Corps to his office. The room was packed. Cigarette smoke hung heavy in the air, mixing with the humidity and the scent of nervous sweat. The reporters sensed blood. They knew a showdown was coming. Lee sat behind his desk, composed, almost serene. He began to speak, his voice dropping to that low baritone register that commanded absolute silence. He recounted the State Department's denial. He repeated their words. Without foundation. He let the phrase hang in the air, tasting the irony. Then he opened a folder. He did not produce a vague memo or a handwritten note. He produced a letter. It was typed on the official stationery of the United States Department of State. It was dated April 15, 1961, and it was signed by Dean Rusk. The name Dean Rusk landed like a bombshell in the room. Rusk was not a nobody. He was the Secretary of State under John F. Kennedy and was currently serving under Lyndon B. Johnson. He was the face of American diplomacy. He was one of the architects of the Cold War, and there, in black and white, was his signature at the bottom of a confession. Lee Kuan Yew began to read the letter aloud to the stunned reporters. I am deeply distressed to learn of this unfortunate incident, Rusk had written. The letter went on to admit the CIA's involvement, apologize for the impropriety of the attempt to bribe the Singaporean official, and offer assurances that disciplinary action would be taken. It was an unconditional apology. It was a smoking gun. It was irrefutable proof that the State Department spokesman who had spoken just 24 hours earlier was either incompetent or lying. The effect was electric. The reporters scrambled for the phones. Flashbulbs popped, illuminating the document that Lee held up for the world to see. He had effectively checkmated the United States of America. He had lured them into a position where they denied the crime, only to reveal that he had the confession of the sheriff in his pocket. But Lee didn't stop at the letter. He used the moment to deliver a lecture on morality and geopolitics that would define his legacy. He looked into the cameras and addressed the American government directly. He brought up the $33 million request. He clarified, with scathing precision, why the negotiation had failed. He told the world that the Americans had offered $3.3 million to the People's Action Party, PAP, his own political vehicle. I told them, Lee thundered, his voice rising with indignation, that if the Americans wanted to pay the Singapore government $33 million for economic development, I was prepared to consider it. But if they offered $3.3 million to the PAP or to me, I would take the money and expose them. He paused, letting the weight of his integrity sink in. I am not a crook, he effectively said, decades before Nixon would use the phrase in a very different context. I am not a mercenary. He painted a picture of the Americans as people who believed that every man had a price and who were baffled when they met a man who cared more about his country than his bank account. Then came the phrase that would be printed in newspapers from London to Tokyo, the phrase that would sting the American establishment more than any other. Lee Kuan Yew leaned forward, his eyes hard, and delivered his verdict on the character of the superpowers. He compared the British, his former colonial masters, with the Americans, the new imperial pretenders. The British, he said, were imperialists. They exploited us, they ruled us, but they knew how to behave. They had rules. Then he turned his ire on the CIA and the State Department. The Americans, he said, are a people with no sense of history. They fight the communists, but they do not understand the people. And then the dagger. They are not gentlemen. They are not gentlemen. It sounded old-fashioned, almost Victorian, but in the context of 1965 diplomacy, it was a savage insult. He was calling them thugs. He was calling them crude, unsophisticated bullies who blundered into countries they didn't understand, waving money and guns, breaking the crockery and lying about it afterwards. He was stripping away the veneer of American moral superiority. The United States claimed to be the leader of the free world, the shining city on a hill. Lee Kuan Yew exposed them as a gang of tawdry bribers who couldn't even keep their own lies straight. The impact was global. The next morning, the New York Times, the paper of record, ran the story on the front page. Lee rebukes U.S. Reveals 61 apology. The humiliation in Washington was total. President Lyndon B. Johnson was reportedly furious, not just at Lee Kuan Yew, but at his own State Department for walking into such an obvious trap. The State Department was forced to issue a second statement, a retraction that was painful to read. They admitted that the denial had been issued in error because the file regarding the 1961 incident had been misplaced in the archives. They had to publicly admit that the Prime Minister of Singapore was telling the truth and that the United States government had lied. It was a total victory for Lee Kuan Yew. He had taken on the Goliath of the modern world and brought him to his knees with a single piece of paper. But the victory was not just about ego. It served a vital strategic purpose. It showed the Malaysians and the Indonesians that Singapore was not an American puppet. It showed the communists in the jungle that Lee Kuan Yew was not a running dog of the imperialists, but a nationalist who would fight anyone, even the Americans, to protect Singapore's dignity. It brought him credibility with the Afro-Asian bloc, the non-aligned nations who were suspicious of Western power. And, strangely, it earned him the respect of the Americans themselves. Once the anger in Washington subsided, the realists in the CIA and the State Department looked at Lee Kuan Yew with new eyes. They realized that this was not a man they could buy. This was not a man they could bully. This was a man they had to treat as an equal. The gentleman incident established the ground rules for the U.S.-Singapore relationship for the next 5 decades. Honesty, bluntness, and mutual respect. Lee Kuan Yew had gambled everything on that press conference. If Dean Rusk hadn't signed that letter, or if Lee had lost it, he would have been destroyed. But he hadn't lost it. He had kept it in his safe, like a loaded gun, waiting for the shadows to lengthen. He proved that in the game of intelligence, the most dangerous weapon isn't a silenced pistol or a poisoned dart. It is the truth, revealed at the exact moment your enemy thinks he is safe. The humiliation of the CIA was complete. They had come to Singapore to teach the locals how to play the game of nations, and instead they had been taken to school. The humiliating public apology of Dean Rusk in 1965 might have looked like the end of the story, a decisive knockout blow that sent the American intelligence community scurrying back to the shadows with their tails between their legs. But in the world of espionage, there are no endings, only pauses. Lee Kuan Yew knew this better than anyone. He understood that the Central Intelligence Agency does not forgive, and it certainly does not forget. He knew that the embarrassment of 1965 would not stop the Americans from trying to shape the future of Singapore. It would only make them more subtle. They would trade the clumsy trench coats and lie detectors for the finer tools of soft power, diplomacy, journalism, and the cultivation of the elite. And so, while the rest of the world moved on, Lee Kuan Yew remained in a state of perpetual vigilance, watching the horizon for the next wave of interference. It took 2 decades, but the wave finally crashed in 1988, proving that the war for Singapore's soul was far from over. To understand the explosion of 1988, we must first look at the battlefield of the 1970s, where Lee fought a brutal, often misunderstood war against the press. To the Western liberal observer, Lee's crackdown on newspapers like the Singapore Herald and the Eastern Sun looked like the actions of a tyrant afraid of criticism. But Lee Kuan Yew did not fear criticism. He feared black ops. He possessed a deep, unshakable conviction that intelligence agencies, both the CIA and the communists, used the media as a Trojan horse. His theory was simple. If you want to topple a government without firing a shot, you buy a newspaper. You fund it through shell companies. You hire editors who are sympathetic to your cause, and you slowly, drip by drip, poison the public mind against the leadership. The case of the Eastern Sun in 1971 was the proof of concept. Lee's internal security apparatus exposed that the paper had received massive loans from communist intelligence sources in Hong Kong in exchange for editorial compliance. But Lee was an equal opportunity skeptic. He turned his gaze to the Singapore Herald, an English-language paper that was critical of his policies, particularly regarding national service and the rugged society. Lee became convinced that the Herald was not just an independent voice, but a vehicle for Western intelligence, specifically the CIA, to soften up the Singaporean population, to introduce liberal, permissive Western values that would erode the discipline he had worked so hard to instill. He believed the Americans were trying to mold Singapore into their own image from the inside out. When he shut these papers down, facing international condemnation, he wasn't attacking free speech in his mind. He was jamming the enemy's radio signals. He famously declared, "Freedom of the press, freedom of the news media, must be subordinated to the overriding needs of the integrity of Singapore." To him, a newspaper funded by foreigners was not a pillar of democracy. It was a foreign agent. This simmering tension between American values and Singaporean sovereignty boiled over again 23 years after the Dean Rusk affair. The year was 1988. Singapore was no longer a struggling port. It was an economic tiger. The Cold War was thawing. But inside the American embassy in Singapore, the old habits of the missionary superpower were still alive and well. The protagonist, this time, was not a bumbling spy with a polygraph, but a polished diplomat named E. Mason Hendrickson. He was the first secretary of the U.S. Embassy, a man with a smile, a budget, and a mandate to promote democracy. But to the Internal Security Department, ISD, of Singapore, promoting democracy looked suspiciously like plotting a coup. The ISD had been tracking Hendrickson for some time. They watched as he held private meetings with disgruntled Singaporean professionals. They watched as he cultivated relationships with lawyers who were critical of the People's Action Party, PAP. The key figure in this drama was Francis Seow, a former Solicitor General turned opposition politician. Seow was charismatic, articulate, and a thorn in Lee Kuan Yew's side. The ISD surveillance revealed that Hendrickson wasn't just observing Seow, he was coaching him. The American diplomat was allegedly urging Seow to unite the fractured opposition parties into a cohesive force to challenge the PAP in the upcoming elections. He was reportedly offering advice, encouragement, and the implicit backing of the United States government. To Lee Kuan Yew, this was 1965 all over again, but more dangerous because it was happening in the open, disguised as diplomacy. It was the classic CIA playbook for regime change. Identify a local dissident, fund him, train him, and use him to destabilize the incumbent government. Lee Kuan Yew did not hesitate. The response was swift and ferocious. He did not care that the United States was Singapore's largest trading partner. He did not care that Singapore hosted American military logistics. He cared only that a foreigner was meddling in the domestic politics of his house. In May 1988, the Singaporean government dropped the hammer. They publicly accused E. Mason Hendrickson of interfering in Singapore's internal affairs. They cited the meetings with Francis Seow. They detailed the conversations. And then, they did the unthinkable for a small ally of the US. They expelled him. Hendrickson was declared persona non grata. He was given 48 hours to pack his bags and leave the island. It was a stunning diplomatic rebuke. Expelling a diplomat is usually reserved for enemy nations, for spies caught stealing military secrets, not for representatives of your closest military ally. The reaction from Washington was one of outrage. The Reagan administration, usually supportive of anti-communist Singapore, felt slapped in the face. In a tit-for-tat retaliation, the US expelled a high-ranking Singaporean diplomat from Washington, D.C. The diplomatic cables were burning. The relationship hit its lowest point since the Gentleman incident, but Lee Kuan Yew was unrepentant. He went on national television. He held rallies. He explained to his people exactly why he had done it. "We are not a client state of the United States," was the message. "We are friends, yes, but friends do not try to overthrow friends." Kuan used the Hendrickson affair to reinforce the narrative he had been building since 1965, that Singapore's existence was fragile, and that threats didn't just come from the communists in the jungle, but from the smiling liberals in the embassies. He argued that the Americans, in their arrogance, believed they knew what was best for Singapore. They believed Singapore needed more opposition, more contention, more Western-style democracy. Lee believed that such things would lead to chaos and racial riots. He viewed Hendrickson's actions not as a promotion of freedom, but as an act of sabotage against the stability that underpinned Singapore's prosperity. The aftermath of the expulsion was a masterclass in Lee's philosophy of sovereignty at any cost. He withstood the diplomatic pressure. He weathered the criticism from the international press, who accused him of fabricating the plot to crush Francis Siao, who was subsequently arrested under the Internal Security Act. Lee didn't care about the optics. He cared about the outcome. And the outcome was clear. The American embassy stopped meddling. The message had been received loud and clear in Washington. The price of interfering in Singaporean politics was public humiliation. This continuity, from the clumsy bribe of 1961 to the sophisticated maneuvering of 1988, reveals the core of Lee Kuan Yew's brilliance. He understood that the CIA and the U.S. State Department operated on the principle of plausible deniability. They relied on the silence of their targets. By refusing to be silent, by consistently exposing their operations to the harsh light of day, Lee Kuan Yew neutralized their power. He turned their own weapon, publicity, against them. The Hendrickson affair also validated Lee's lifelong suspicion of the black ops of the press. In his mind, the diplomats and the journalists were two sides of the same coin. They were agents of influence, trying to impose a Western worldview on an Asian society. By expelling Hendrickson, he was also sending a warning to every foreign journalist in Singapore. "If I can kick out an American diplomat, imagine what I can do to you." It created a buffer zone of sovereignty, a psychological force field around the island that forced the superpowers to treat Singapore with a level of caution and respect that was disproportionate to its size. In retrospect, the continuous war was not a war of bullets, but a war of boundaries. Lee Kuan Yew spent his entire life drawing lines in the sand and daring giants to cross them. The 1965 exposure of the CIA bribe was the first line. The 1988 expulsion of Hendrickson was the second. Together, they form a complete picture of a leader who refused to be bullied. He showed that a small nation could survive in a world of predators, but only if it was willing to be prickly, difficult, and fiercely, unapologetically independent. The expulsion of Hendrickson proved that the gentleman incident wasn't a fluke of a young, angry prime minister. It was the calculated policy of a mature statesman who knew exactly where the bodies were buried and who wasn't afraid to dig them up if the sovereignty of his nation was at stake. As the dust settles on the declassified files of the CIA and the echoes of Dean Rusk's apology fade into history, we are left with a singular crystallization of statecraft. The story of how Lee Kuan Yew humiliated the Central Intelligence Agency is not merely a colorful anecdote of the Cold War, it is the definitive case study of his geopolitical philosophy. It resolves the paradox that baffled observers for decades. How could a leader be so vehemently anti-communist, so culturally aligned with the West, and yet so hostile to American interference? The answer lies in a simple, non-negotiable principle that defined the Singaporean ethos. Independence is not a gift you receive, it is a space you clear with your elbows. Lee Kuan Yew was, in many ways, the ultimate realist. He knew that Singapore needed the United States. He needed their markets to sell his goods, he needed their technology to modernize his industries, and he needed their military presence in the Pacific to hold back the tide of communism. But he drew a sharp, bloody line between alliance and subservience. He understood that the moment a small nation allows a superpower to dictate its internal affairs, to bribe its officers, buy its parties, or steer its press, it ceases to be a nation and becomes a vassal. To Lee, being a client state was a fate worse than death. It was a betrayal of the very struggle for survival that birthed the nation. The lesson of the CIA incident is the doctrine of the poison shrimp. Lee Kuan Yew knew that Singapore could never defeat the United States or Indonesia or Malaysia in a conventional war. Singapore was a shrimp in an ocean of whales, but he decided that if the shrimp could not be strong, it had to be poisonous. It had to be indigestible. By exposing the CIA agent, by rejecting the $3.3 million bribe, and by forcing the Secretary of State to apologize publicly, he was demonstrating his toxicity. He was telling the world's giants, "You can try to swallow us, but we will cause you such internal pain, such diplomatic embarrassment, and such political nausea that you will regret the attempt." This strategy worked. It is the ultimate irony that after the humiliation of 1965, the relationship between the United States and Singapore did not collapse. It flourished. American presidents from Nixon to Obama sought Lee Kuan Yew's counsel. Henry Kissinger called him one of the greatest strategists of the 20th century. Why? Because the Americans realized that a puppet tells you what you want to hear, but a sovereign leader tells you the truth. By proving he could not be bought, Lee Kuan Yew proved he was worth listening to. The respect that Singapore commands on the global stage today, punching far above its weight class, was bought with the currency of that confrontation. In the final analysis, the $33 million that Lee Kuan Yew demanded was never the point. The point was the no. In a world where every third world dictator was lining up with a begging bowl, willing to sell their country's soul for a pallet of US dollars or Soviet rifles, Lee Kuan Yew stood up and said, "Keep your money. We will build this country ourselves." That refusal is the spiritual foundation of modern Singapore. It is a nation built on the terrifying, exhilarating belief that no one owes you a living and no one owns your future. The skyscrapers of Marina Bay Sands and the efficient machinery of the Singaporean state stand as monuments to many things: capitalism, discipline, foresight. But above all, they are monuments to dignity. The story of the CIA bribe is a reminder that sovereignty is not just about flags and anthems. It is about the capacity to say no to the most powerful force on earth and survive. Lee Kuan Yew beat the CIA at their own game, not because he had better spies, but because he had a stronger conviction. He knew that a nation that can be bought is a nation that is already dead. And as the Americans learned the hard way in that interrogation room in 1961, and again in the press conference of 1965, the island of Singapore might be small, it might be vulnerable, and it might be surrounded, but it is not, and never has been, for sale.